Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is Peter Robbins. Before I bring him on, just want to remind you that you can always get new episodes free on Rokfin, Odysee, and all podcast platforms. Check us out on Rokfin. If you don't want to get any ads and get all of our amazing premium content, Rokfin is where you go. You get not only that, but all of the amazing content and premium content from every creator on Rokfin. Check out the new podcast from the Forbidden Knowledge News Network. We've got Inception, Raised by Giants, Day Zero, Dawson Time, and of course Forbidden Knowledge News and Beyond Classified. Finally, check out C60 Purple Power. It may be the most powerful antioxidant known to man. You guys hear me talk about it all the time. It has helped me with inflammation, energy, sleep, well-being, and the list goes on. You can even get C60 for your pets, and your pets can feel great too. Click the link in the description. You get 10% off your order plus free shipping. Tonight I want to welcome Peter Robbins. He is one of America's most respected investigative writers, specializing in the subject of UFOs. He is a regular guest on American and British radio and has appeared as a guest on and been consultant to numerous television shows and documentaries. He has appeared on Ancient Aliens, Britain's Roswell, Unsolved Mysteries, Good Day New York, The O'Reilly Factor, among many other programs, radio shows, and podcasts too numerous to mention. He also hosts a weekly radio show, Meanwhile Here on Earth, on KGRA. Peter, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
Good. Yourself?
I am great, and I've been looking forward today. It's going to be a great time. You have a lifetime of research and extraordinary experiences, and I know for me, my thoughts and theories about this whole phenomenon evolve and change almost every day. The way I feel about it is completely different than the way I felt about it last week, and I still think I have Zippo when it comes to answers to this stuff. But I know a lot more than I did when I first started looking into it, I can say that much. And also with each new guest like yourself, I can sift through the information, put it in my bank, and kind of go through it later, and it adds to this whole kind of paranormal soup, I guess you could call it. This is your first time on the show. I'd love you to tell us about what got you started down your path, and what led you to where you are today.
As a young person, I was fortunate in excelling at one thing, which was in the visual arts. And I knew when I was fairly young that I wanted to be an artist and have a career in New York City. I studied art, obviously did well enough in high school in it, studied it at university for 2 years, and then transferred to New York School of Visual Arts, where I graduated from and ultimately became a faculty member. And I appreciate that most people don't get to follow a dream, certainly one that they had from the time that they were really young. And I was well on my way to making that dream come true. Everything changed, though, with the return of a repressed childhood memory. I was born in New York City, but my sisters and I came of age on Long Island, about 30 miles east of Manhattan. And on one particular eventful late morning, my sister Helen and I observed, coming in at a very high rate of speed, 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects in a very precise V formation that simply stopped over the neighbor's house and just stayed there. And it was unlike, of course, anything that had ever happened to us. It was a very different time. I was a very innocent kid, quite unsophisticated. My only take on flying saucers, per se, was the ones that I would enjoy sometimes with my geeky friends at the movie theater, and the great B movies that were available to us then. But I guess I intuited from the adult world that that's the only place they were real. And here they were. And I will stress that they were elliptical, like holding a dinner plate at an angle at a distance. They were metallic, no question. We could both make out regular detailing around the edge of each that many years later, when that memory came back to me and we finally discussed it, we could only read the way that you might see windows on a commercial airliner at an appreciable distance. And watching them and realizing, they weren't moving, they made no sound, there were no appendages, that everything I thought I knew was now open to question. And at the same time, it wasn't a question I was interested in asking. Everybody knew that it was a silly subject. And, in the world of kids and adults, last thing you want to do is call ridicule to yourself. And I was overwhelmed. I was completely overwhelmed. And to compress the story a little bit, I either was knocked out, which seems to be the case, and as I know from decades of study in contact and abduction cases, if it's siblings or a couple or whatever, the interest seems to be in one individual and not the other. And while I was unconscious, my sister was taken, and she had very clear conscious memories of that for the rest of her life. But when she asked me later that afternoon if I wanted to talk about what we had seen, I said no. And into this conversation more than 14 years later, early on, I asked her, why haven't we ever talked about this? And she reminded me that she had asked me that afternoon if I wanted to, and that I said no. And that one day led to the next and on to the years. And that was her understanding. I was uncomfortable with it. But that day that we had that conversation, and after she confirmed what we saw, which was very exciting and anxiety provoking at the same moment, she then told me about her memories of being on board, etc. This at a time before abduction studies were really, even in their infancy, within the world of UFO research. And even the term gray for that ubiquitous type of being did not exist for at least another decade or two. And I had no idea there was anything called ufology or UFO conferences or people that did this work. And as much as I wanted to follow on the dream I had since I was a kid, all of a sudden something more compelling, more important, more immediate obsessed me. And I resented it. I don't mind telling you. But over the next weeks and months, I simply began to shift gears. And although I continued to teach painting and show my work, the heart had gone out of it to a good degree. And that is ultimately how I got started.
It's amazing how these experiences can change people's courses in their lives. I was doing this show before I had my contact experience, but it wasn't, I didn't have a career out of it. I wasn't, paying bills or anything with it. But it's funny, after my contact experience, I went all in on this, and it completely changed everything. And I know a lot of people who have had profound paranormal or UFO or anything they really can't explain, and they just dive into that field of study or something surrounding that, and that just shows how profound this whole phenomenon is. After you you started getting into this field, did you have any other profound experiences?
Oh gosh, many years later, in beginning to investigate a case that I guess I became most closely associated with over the years, England's so-called Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. I was in England on location, a few miles away from the events that I was beginning to document, with my then co-author. And the very first night of our very first visit, I only thought we'd be going once, but I've been back to the UK 20 or 25 times since. We had a profound multiple UFO sighting, which is documented in the book that we wrote, because I had tape recorders and we were audio taping what we were seeing the whole time. And it was, again, very shocking, and also presented a challenge to me as an investigative writer, a fairly novice one. But how could I write? Oh, on our first night of our first visit to the location, we saw 25 or 30 UFOs. It sounded ludicrous. And I realized I had three choices. One was to not write about it. And that, for me, would have been a lie by omission. The other was just to mention it in a sentence like that. And I didn't think that would wash very well either. So I spent literally 7 months. This is, pre-smartphones and all that stuff. We're talking 1988. Listening to those tapes over and over and over again with the headset, in part because we were out in the field and the wind was ripping across the top of the mic and there was a lot of distortion. And I knew this transcript would certainly have a possibility of being questioned, which I would do if I was reading a book like that. So I wanted to get it right. That was my only other major UFO type sighting, certainly.
Now, since you started, since you had that very first experience and started researching this, what are the most profound changes in your way of thinking or your perception of this phenomenon has occurred for you? Just like I said, the way I think about it when I first started years ago is completely different now. Anything like that for you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My immediate thought was the main one that was really out there, the extraterrestrial hypothesis that my sister and I were observing when all was said and done. Technology of a very advanced sort, under intelligent control, coming and going for reasons we can only guess at. And it wasn't until several years into my reading that I began to open my thoughts to that is one of a number of possibilities. I understood from the beginning, common sense as well as educating myself, that many, if not most, so-called unidentified flying objects, now more commonly referred to as unidentified aerial phenomena, are explainable in more conventional or other less exotic terms. And then there were the writings of people like Jacques Vallée, which presuppose that who knows if there's an extraterrestrial reality, but if there is, there's certainly the possibility of interdimensional type intelligences and everything else. I guess I was fairly fortunate in a sense in that from the get-go, my initial take on individuals in the work was they were probably crazy or, looking for attention or believers. I knew my sister and I weren't, I thought. And in the first 2 years or so that I was involved, I found my first three mentors. The first being a retired Hungarian army officer who in World War II was in charge of photo analysis and photo reconnaissance for the Hungarian military. The second was a tough, no-nonsense New York City police detective and also a crack UFO investigator. And from them, I learned a methodology that I overall still follow, which is very nuts and bolts and building a case on different kinds of evidence. Less than a year into my obsession, I read an article in a New York City paper about an individual who had a sighting, a very dramatic one. And up until that moment, it was actually the best written and best documented piece that I had read outside of, say, Donald Kehoe's work. And the name of the author was Bud Hopkins. I was a painter, and the New York City art world is fairly incestuous, even though it's international. And I knew there was a painter, late period abstract expressionist, who had moved beyond that by that name. And I simply cracked the New York City phone book. I wanted to speak to this guy, and there was only one. And I cold called him. And I came over a few days later for coffee. This was right at the beginning of the time that Bud Hopkins was becoming interested in the subject as well. And it began an acquaintanceship that became a friendship, that became a very good friendship, and ultimately a work relationship over the next 35 years. I worked for Bud a good part of that time as his assistant. And my thinking, because most of my work with him involved people who had not had a beatific, wonderful, heartrending contact experience. It had left them shaken, anxious, confused, or traumatized. And the beings involved overall were in this category that we describe as grays. But even focused on that milieu for years, my thinking and my reading continued to reinforce for me that we are probably dealing with a myriad of other intelligences. And certainly, even the most skeptical, recalcitrant astronomers and space scientists begrudgingly acknowledge that there are probably tens of millions of sun-sized stars with planets about the size of Earth, about the same distance from them, giving us a formula for, if you're a person of faith, the miracle of creation. If you're a secular thinking person, the building blocks of basic life that would result in that first primordial single-celled animal. And that space is probably teeming with life, and some of it quite advanced. And for any number of reasons, this little planet is important or significant or meaningful to more species off planet than we might imagine. And that they might run the gamut that we run in terms of empathy or callousness, in terms of seeing us as, somebody's graduate experiment gone horribly wrong and needing some assistance, not to mention what we are doing to our host organism here, and others who would be just as happy if we weren't here. So my thinking is all over the place, but informed by, again, as good an education as one can get in this field over the decades, having wonderful colleagues who I've learned from over the years, having had the honor of traveling to a degree all over the world to speak with and spend time with people who are as involved in this subject as I am, and also knowing how little I know, that I can confirm, that I could present in a court of law. Sometimes that takes people aback because I've been involved in this seriously for over 40 years. You're supposed to be an expert, a word that makes me wince because, as I pointed out occasionally when a radio or podcast host will introduce me as an expert on UFOs, that it's kind of the ultimate oxymoron. You're an expert on the unknown.
Right.
So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You were talking earlier, you mentioned Jacques Vallée and the possibility of interdimensional entities in contact. There seems to be a kind of crossover when it comes to some type of paranormal activity in this. Like you look at shadow people or places like Skinwalker Ranch where all this stuff is happening in one place, or other places of high strangeness, there seems to be, in a lot of cases, this crossover between lots of types of paranormal activity and UFOs and whatever these entities may be. Is that something that you've kind of seen as well?
Originally, certainly in my first years in this work, I considered myself a purist. I'm just involved in this area of study.
Yeah.
In part, it was also a defense against a certain type of ridicule. Oh, you're into UFOs. Are you into ghosts as well? And, reincarnation and, ancient mysteries and all this. Well,
Right.
to one degree or another, a lot of things interest me. You see a small reflection of it in part of my library behind me.
Right.
But it's kind of a setup for, oh, you're just some new age goofball. In fact, without having focused on it, I have observed or learned or been basically brought into so many people's accounts who have been minding their own business, living their lives, and then, either get in touch with earlier things that may have or have happened to them, or are confronted with another dimension, another reality, and other things seem to open up. There is at least some kind of informal relationship between different kinds of, shall we say, high strangenesses.
Yeah.
And I now am aware of colleagues, certainly, who are not, I vibrate on a certain level on a low frequency. I don't know how else to say it. I'm not an astute student of UFOs and consciousness. I respect and am fascinated by what I read and what I learn and what people I find credible have been sharing with me over the years. But that there are now more and more people in the research community or experiencers who are articulate and courageous and willing to come forward to share some of these interrelationships between, hardcore UFO sightings, experiences, abduction type experiences, and other types of paranormal experiences for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about the aspect of the phenomenon where it changes over the years? You may look back in the beginning of the 1920s and 30s, these things looked like airships, and then they went on to silver discs, and they evolved into more of like these plasma type things in modern times, and these energy orbs, and just it seems to evolve with people's collective consciousness, if you kind of look at it that way. I'd like to get your thoughts on what could be happening with this evolution of ufology and what we're seeing in the skies.
I think you're referring to the mystery airships that started to
Well,
appear
right.
over certain parts of the United States in 1797, 1798, which fascinate me, absolutely fascinating. I have my own conclusion is that these were part of a whole nother reality, the reality being, and it sounds kind of corny and steampunk, but if we're talking strange, this is lesser strange than visitations from Alpha Centauri or whatever, that there may well have been several individuals with the means, the vision, and the money to build airships secretly and to get them up there and, lit by their own little electric generators and things, freaking out local populaces, creating a certain mythology, and then going back to their hangars somewhere. The fact that there was no big news break that, this multimillionaire has now been exposed as the creator of this airship. It is an abiding mystery. However, I think in part, we're seeing manifestations of how can I say, of different visitations that, again, we're looking at this through the other end of the telescope, so to say, and sometimes asking questions that they could care less about, like, are they good, are they bad? That when you start looking actively, as opposed to, not looking, one sees things that one wouldn't see otherwise. When the first drones started to go up, and they were highly classified technology in the Southwest primarily, they were reported as hardcore UFOs, and understandably. The orb phenomena, when I first heard about it, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, my first thought was, as a photographer, refractions within, a sophisticated camera lens. I know that can happen. And I was pretty skeptical about it until maybe 10 years ago, when I was actually back in Suffolk, England, and going out on a night walk into the Rendlesham Forest, never by myself, with a number of local friends. And we were in pitch darkness on the edge of a farmer's field, alleged to be involved in the events of 1980. And I thought, oh, what the hell? I've got my little digital camera here. I've got a flash on it, and just fired off a couple of pictures with, again, in pitch darkness with my friends there, and immediately saw the results, that there were these things that looked like sort of soft soap bubbles, that we would call orbs, that there was no credible scientific real world explanation for. Also, even though some of the people that I was with were smokers, nobody was smoking at that moment, and there was a discernible smoke or mist in the air that would not have been there. So for me, that was one more confirmation and mind expanding little detail of something that I still do not understand. A lot of people in the work ultimately elevate a theory to, in their mind, a fact. And I have a problem with that, where somebody will say all aliens are good. Well, that's outrageous, and it only makes the whole field look loopy. Or that there are 57 different kinds of races visiting, our planet. You could be the president of the United States, the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, every world leader rolled into one, and throw in the supreme leaders of 18 alien races to boot, and you could not empirically state that for a fact. It's an unknowable quotient, no matter what secret sources you may have in the intelligence community. But people are looking for answers. And in the same way that religion provides certain answers for people, where belief supported by faith, reinforced by other people, many other people in many cases, who believe the same thing, gives you, for you, the reality, for me, the illusion, that is an absolute fact. And how can you argue with that? It's also a challenge in the world of UFO studies to put forward a thesis like that and say, prove me wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right when it comes to the question of are they good or are they bad? I think just like with humans and everything else, there's good and bad in everything. I do think that there's 100% definite interest in us with whatever these entities are, at least the ones that are visiting us and could possibly be taking people and doing these experiments that are reported by people who have experienced these things. Based on all the accounts that you've gone over and everyone's experience that you've heard about, do you think that these entities are, I don't want to say a threat, but do you think that we are some kind of possible experiment for them? What do you think is the interest of some of the entities that are visiting us or having most interaction?
Well, there's a whole bunch of answers. And I think there are multiple answers that are true, because I am convinced at this point, as much as I can be, that we're dealing with an entirely different groupings of entities in different situations, in different relationships with humanity, some of who may have been coming and going for hundreds of thousands of years, and in the exact same way that we are tweaking the DNA of organic materials, plants, and animals in laboratory settings, that they've been doing that with us and our precursors since time immemorial. That may freak some people out, the same way that, what, fake meat grown in a laboratory? I'll never eat that stuff. But this is all doable now, and on a rudimentary level, doable by us. So, you can say, gosh, maybe they're 50,000 years ahead of us, or 5 million years ahead of us. It's, if you try to make believe that you understand the leaps of possible knowledge and technology, I think you're deluding yourself. The best we can do is understand that some of this stuff is just out of our reach. Again, you look at the history in the last couple of 100,000 years of this planet. Certainly nature has its cycles. And it was just only a few years ago that an awful lot of people are saying, no, this whole climate change thing is either nonsense or it's all natural, but certainly we have nothing to do with it. I think part of that is driven by the idea, for some people who are quietly horrified that human activity could have been so destructive, that it's actually changing for the worse all of the aspects of the things that support life on this planet. But even just since the early 1800s, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, how many zillions of tons of CO2 have been pumped into the atmosphere just from coal all by itself. And this mania that we human beings have to make more human beings. It's considered sacrosanct to even suggest that people practice what, when I was a kid, was called family planning. And I remember as a kid, I grew up in a political family, at least in terms of, dinner table talk, the idea that we were approaching a time when there would be 1 billion people on the earth. Oh my gosh, we had never had this many people. And could the earth support that many people? And now we have 7, 8 billion people. And that number is expanding geometrically, not arithmetically. And we are simply not able to support that reality. If I were another intelligence coming to visit the earth with a pre-existing relationship with this planet and the species, I would be kind of horrified, because the damage that we are doing, and that we don't seem to be able to stop doing to a degree, by the time, first world countries begin to go carbon neutral in reality, third world countries are going to be saying, hey, you did it, we're doing it, we want that car, we want that air conditioner, we want that refrigerator in that little house, and so what if it burns fuel? We're here right now and this is our life. I don't know what I would do. I mean, I think back sometimes, there are very few models for me in terms of real human behavior to check this. But every once in a while in the world of science fiction, a model comes up that you say, well, if it came to that, I could get that. The Day the Earth Stood Still, one of the best B science fiction movies ever, where a being and a giant robot come to Earth to let the forces that be and the world governments know that if we don't check our destructive behavior, in this case, developing nuclear warfare, that this planet will be burnt to a cinder. And the way that they keep it together is everybody has these huge robots that are just programmed to kill you if you're going to kill anybody, in so many words. In other words, install kind of a totalitarian reality, because we aren't responsible enough to take care of ourselves. that's a pretty scary scenario too, as
Yeah.
opposed to, say, the Star Trek model of we've made it through, we've evolved, we are members of, the Federation, and we're out in space to explore and make peaceful connections. Good luck with that one too.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. If I was an advanced species passing by our planet and I look down, I might not want to stop yet. I might want to wait a few thousand years till we develop a little more. But that's just
My
me.
la- my
Go ahead.
last great mentor, and one of the most respected and beloved figures in the world of UFO studies, who passed a couple of years ago, Stanton T. Friedman, who devoted more than half a century of his life to this work, and was a retired nuclear physicist, so had some street cred that a lot of us wouldn't. Also had a fairly dry sense of humor, and he once theorized that maybe the Earth was where all of the other interplanetary beings and civilizations sent people convicted of crimes on their planets and in their solar systems to go, yeah, hang out on Earth for a couple of years and see how lucky you had it here.
Right. Oh man, yeah. That's a good example. Now, when it comes to us and our capabilities and what we could probably be putting in the sky or have reverse engineered, there's a lot of people that are of the mind that, all of this is ours. We just testing some top secret stuff, that there's some of the mind that some of it's ours. We reverse engineered some off-planet technology and we're testing a lot of this stuff. How much of the UFO or UAP phenomenon do you think is just us testing stuff?
Well, I think, to start with, in 1947, one can argue that there was kind of this Marvel Comics superhero advanced, super secret group that was, 100 years of where we are ahead in terms of technology, or that it was the Nazis who cracked it and that there was their flying saucers we were seeing. The fact is, for me, for the authentic documented sightings and radar confirmations and air-to-air sightings that we were getting in the 1940s, nothing that we were remotely capable of could explain. And for those who try to pass off that possibility, I find it laughable. As we advance technologically, and we've been advancing at an extraordinary rate, of course, nobody would question that. It's fair to say, could we have gotten where we are now with fiber optics, stealth aircraft, the internet, the level of computing technology that we have, advances in gene splicing and every other cutting edge area of science, to a degree, space exploration, if you want to call it that, on our own? Or would we have had to have had some help in terms of, and it's a good term, a good phrase, back engineering. It came into use 20 odd years ago. I'm of two minds there. The first is that, yeah, that's not out of the question. I do take very seriously that there have been crashes and recoveries. Certainly the best known being the one in New Mexico in 1947, some miles from a then small town called Roswell. However, and it was a discussion I used to have on and off with Bud Hopkins, at our best, we human beings, when we are working together and we have the funding that we need and the drive and the support, we are capable of creating literally anything that we've been able to conceive of. That's us at our best. Could we have gotten from there to here on our own? Sure. I feel that's not out of the question. Could we have gotten from there to here because of super top secret engineering breakthroughs, involving the back engineering of advanced technology from off planet. Sure, that's a possibility too. Better than that, I can't say.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Now, what do you think about what is happening now in the mainstream with ufology and the kind of slow drip disclosure, I guess you could say, that's coming out? I don't even know if you want to call it that at all, but it seems that since 2017, when that New York Times article hit, there's been slight upticks here and there, and then in 2020 we had a kind of huge media outpouring about UFOs, and then they reel it back a little bit, and it keeps kind of going on and off like that over the past couple of years. But there's definitely more talk now than I've heard in a long time, and it seems like more people are open to the idea. Do you think this has been an intentional type of thing done by our government and media because maybe they know something, or is there another reason? What do you think is behind it?
Well, they definitely know more than something. They know pretty much everything there is to know that they're capable of knowing, and a great deal of it they've known since the get-go. However, for starters, as somebody who made it their business for some years as a specialty area of research to try to get to the bottom of what I would call the origins of the ridicule factor, which all happened in the summer of 1947. It was media driven, and driven by the most powerful media organizations in this country. It might have had tacit support or encouragement from high up in the United States government, but with the advent of the beginning of the modern age of UFO sightings in 1947, it was almost driven into the consciousness of the average American, and very quickly, by extension, the Western world, that anybody who thought these things, these so-called flying discs or flying saucers, might possibly be what I'm convinced some of them are, advanced technology from off the planet under intelligent control, was either crazy or a mystic or looking for attention or some kind of con man, or somebody wanted to be famous. Wilhelm Reich, maybe the greatest millennial scientist of the last 1,000 years on a certain level for me, a wonderful phrase, a quote of his was evasion of the obvious. Of course. Stanton Friedman once said, the question, if I'm off, it's by a word. The question is not, are all UFOs advanced technology under intelligent control? The question is, has one ever been? And the answer to that is a resounding yes, based on the kind of evidence you could bring to court if you were a mind to study the evidence. And a lot of people aren't. They like to be armchair judges and just, nope, I don't believe that. And that sounds silly. And I'm certainly not going to waste my time reading about it. But it's so counterintuitive. If you and I were neighbors and we ran into each other on the street one day, and I said, the damnedest thing happened to me last night or yesterday afternoon. I was playing with the kids or mowing the lawn or washing the car or reading the paper, and I looked out the window or I looked up in the sky and I saw this thing or things. And I never saw anything in the sky that shape or those shapes or move like that. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I'm not stupid. I know that planes can't make a right angle turn, or, things as big as stars zigzag, or something as big as a battleship float, over my home without making a sound. And I wonder what it was or what they were in a logical, real world situation. I'm guessing you might say or think, gee, that's interesting. I wonder what they were too. But that's not what happened. And it was hardwired into the consciousness of Americans, and again, the rest of the world. And phrases like, flying saucers and little green men just became shorthand you're crazy, you're a mystic, you're delusional, you want to feel special. Well, what happened in 2017, and it actually started some months before the December articles that kind of kicked off major attention in the New York Times,
Yeah.
when Ralph Blumenthal, one of the co-authors of the articles and longtime Times staff writer, traveled up to Syracuse, New York, and interviewed a woman named Cheryl Costa, who is a UFO statistician. And although it didn't get the publicity that the Leslie Kean, Blumenthal, and another good writer worked on in December, it received some respect. And I can tell you, as somebody who has read, maybe the only person you'll ever meet who has read every single article, editorial, caption, letter to the editor that the New York Times has ever published on the subject of UFOs, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, that let's say 97% of it has been condescending, sarcastic, dismissive, and absolutely insulting to anything remotely truthful.
Right.
But that started to change. And do I think that, the government orchestrated this? No, just the opposite. I think that the secret keepers kind of lost control of the secret, and none of the old ploys would work anymore. You can't now tell the public it's swamp gas. It's refractions, on the clouds from strange weather phenomena, that it's Brownian movement on the eyeballs, one of my favorites from back in the 40s, that it's, any of that nonsense. However, the internet, which can be a wonderful source of information and absolutely the worst place to look for anything credible on the subject, because people hide behind fake identities. Anything can be doctored or created in a Photoshop type way. Images that are put forward, whether it's still images or footage, without provenance, without a credible individual or individuals who viewed them, who filmed them, information on how they were filmed or where they were filmed. Anything approaching even a rudimentary photo analysis should be taken with a grain of salt, or a salt shaker full of salt. And it has become kind of in vogue for people to do this. I don't really understand it. It's this part of human nature that's been exacerbated by our modern age of, you can create false identities and fool people and, take pleasure in making people believe things that aren't true, when the reality is right there in any case. I think what's happening right now, though, is that the disclosure process is happening organically. For example, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, a nice American couple, paying their taxes, raising their kids, working, saving, being good citizens, who maybe did take this subject seriously, would never discuss it outside of perhaps a close circle of friends or correspondents, couldn't allow themselves to be caught going to a UFO conference, or having people come in and seeing a whole shelf of UFO books. We are now at a point where more and more people care less and less about what other people think about what they think about this subject, and that's a very healthy thing. Also, because of the hard work and dedication of a tiny group of people, at the center of which is a colleague and dear friend of mine, Stephen Bassett. There are disclosure groups and movements all over the world. Now, they're not changing their government's position necessarily, but they are educating each other and educating other people in their countries. And we're moving more and more, it may still be many years away, or it may be around the corner, to a critical mass among the population. There is an illusion that is shared by many people in the work that, wow, you care, I care, we're involved in this is so cool, that they actually represent a substantial amount of the general public. They don't, we don't. And most folks are still, they're busy with other things like paying their bills, hoping they have health care, worrying about the pandemic, all the regular human things. Right now, the last, in June, the report came out from the Pentagon, and it was what many of us suspected it would be. To quote Shakespeare, much ado about nothing. It wasn't quite nothing, but it didn't tell us anything new. What it said to me was, this is completely scripted. We are behaving as though, my goodness, we're getting interested in this. And what could those tic-tac things be that were photographed in 2002 or 2006 by the Navy? And we need to get to the bottom of this. Now, we know that the version that came to the public was highly redacted, and certainly a lot of the information suppressed and censored out. It would be interesting, and probably in time we will have an idea of the full report, the one that went to members of Congress and the cabinet and key people in the Pentagon, military industrial establishment, etc. But it probably isn't that much more. But expect the United States government to continue to issue reports, maybe a few a year, as long as they can get away with it, in part because they are never willingly going to admit anything even remotely exotic, a recovered crash, the abduction phenomena, which, by the way, is very real, hybrids, these things that sound like science fiction but are not. And I can't imagine them doing it willingly unless their hand were forced, and we can only, imagine what that would take. In the meantime, though, this is not going away. It is now even a safe subject for elected officials and scientists and academics to begin to talk about, think about, write about publicly. And that is a huge breakthrough. That's historic.
Was muted there. Okay. To close out, I have it's a two-part question, really. First is, in some aspects, some authorities are kind of painting it as a threat. Some people believe it may be a threat. I personally believe they had the chance to wipe us out 1,000 times over. That's just my thoughts. But do you think they're a threat? And the second part is, do you think that humanity as a whole is ready to find out that we're really not alone, and how far it could really go?
Great question. I agree with you in that if they, or a specific group of them, wanted to vaporize our asses, they could have done it decades ago. And that's the good news. Do I think that we feel they're a threat? It's the most understandable human question, but it's kind of the wrong question. They, like you say, they can do what they want. And some of them may be of a mind that they're not fans of the human race, certainly at this point in our revolution. And if we kind of breed ourselves out of existence or pollute this planet to the point where it can no longer support our lives, good. Or that they are already in control in their own ways, behind the scenes, orchestrating on some level the day-to-day activities in a way that's not even perceivable to the average person. I think that it's not out of the question, once again, that we're dealing with different intelligences, different civilizations, different mind groups, so to say, that have very different relationships with us or very different ideas about us. If you're a government and, it's a tradition that goes back millennia, your thoughts are protect your people, grab territory, become stronger. History is written by the winners. And if you cross that line, you other guys will kill you because you're on our side of the line. And who do you think you are? You're the other. So they're the ultimate other. And of course, no matter, we come in peace. My favorite bad aliens, the Martians from Mars Attacks.
Yes.
The military is going to think in military terms. As they say, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there's no question in my mind that there are elements within, the human family, the militaries of various governments, that they're not in the Welcome Space Brothers mode of thinking. They're thinking of where can we get budgets to do bigger and bigger weapons? And once again, as Stanton Friedman pointed out, I think prophetically, whoever can fully crack this technology first and weaponize it, you're the winner. You now have the ultimate weapon, whatever that might be. And certainly a lot of this is probably going on behind the scenes. However, there's also no question in my mind that the likelihood is that there are intelligences out there that wish us well, or at least want us to think they do, and are doing their best to make contact with human beings as they have done for possibly thousands of years. We can only guess at that, in a way that is compassionate. And, people say, well, why don't they show themselves? There's the question about, are we ready for it? I think every reasonable person in their heart of hearts has had moments, even if they're publicly skeptical about the subject, where maybe we're not alone. And maybe some of those UFO things are machines from other places. How am I about that? If I'm a person of faith, how does that affect my notions of God? And I should say here that on my radio show, the podcast, once it's recorded, in a week and a half from when we're doing this show, I'm going to have a panel discussion with several ministers, a rabbi, several lay Catholic scholars on UFOs and religion, UFOs and disclosure, UFOs in the Bible. I personally, by the way, a little free advertising here, my show is called Meanwhile Here on Earth. It's on KGRA Digital Broadcasting on Monday nights for 2 hours from 7 to 9 Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you'll consider subscribing, or you can listen to it live for free. But it's a question we'll be addressing in that panel discussion. I personally, this is based on research for other projects some time back, people of faith overall, it just confirms that the miracle of creation extends out into the cosmos.
Yeah.
Any religious person who is a fundamentalist, who is absolutely unyielding, rigid in the literal teachings without any possibility of interpretation or sway, they may have a problem. They see these as, demons or, whatever it is that they want to characterize them as. Will the stock market crash? Will the petrochemical industry crash? We don't know. And when people say, well, why does the government keep secrets? Well, I think the original secret was, in fact, are people ready for this? It was another time. It was 1947. We had just come out of World War II, and so to say, made the world safe for democracy. We were the country in many respects, many of us wish we were now. The Marshall Plan was helping our former enemies rebuild their societies and develop constitutional democracies. Look at Russia, look at Japan and look at Germany. Who have they attacked since 1945? Exemplary. Yeah. If only we had followed in their model in an ironic way.
Right.
Anyway, I think we're dealing with some wild cards here, but it's one of the reasons that the secret keepers continue to keep the secrets, because they don't want to risk. Also, because the secret keepers probably have pretty major egos and don't want the world to see them for what they are, which is just bugs like the rest of us who don't have any more control over this than any of us do.
Yeah, that's very well said. Peter, man, thank you so much for coming on. You told us about your radio show, Meanwhile Here on Earth. If people want to follow you, do you have any other social media or anything like that if people are interested in learning more?
Thank you for asking. I don't right now. I'm working on a platform that in some months will go online, which will be essentially a central clearinghouse of information, more being added all the time. Right now, that show is my main project, and I do ask that you consider subscribing. Otherwise, hang out with me on Facebook. I know it's a tiny spark in the great cosmos of social media. I will join more of the 21st century soon, but right now, got my hands full doing what I'm doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time, Peter, to come hang out with us today. That was excellent information, and I'd sure love talking to you again in the future.
You bet.
Awesome. Well, have a great day, and until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening, and of course, we'll talk again tomorrow.